First thing I want to say is I'm not going to revisit everything that brought us to this point. By now, some of the highlights of those facts are very well known. We all know that the economic crisis started really way back when the phase out of the 1936 tax exemption culminated around mid 2005, 2006 when that was sunset. And from there on, Puerto Rico has not been able to have a significant growth period, let alone stop that decline, steady decline in the economy. And that by itself affected the fiscal crisis. But even at that point, about half of the population in Puerto Rico are poor. So it's not to say that this occurred in a vacuum. There was already an unfolding humanitarian crisis, if you will, for, with almost 2/3 of the children in Puerto Rico growing up in poverty, with a significant portion of the elderly living in poverty and so forth. Now, that was obviously aggravated, but let me point out that it was also a political crisis, way back, in part because of the status issue, and more recently with the imposition of the Fiscal Oversight Management Board, which by itself is evidence number one, exhibit number one, on the political crisis of the relationship between Puerto Rico and the United States, unsolved issues for more than 100 years. And that's not going to go away anytime soon, but it's part of the crisis. And on top of all that, we have this summer, right, the ousting of Governor Rosselló. So the reality is that all of this was aggravated with a catastrophic event that occurs once every 100 years or perhaps even 500 years. If you look at the maps of flooding in Puerto Rico because of Maria, and you look at the catastrophic event of FEMA-defined 500 years event, one event in every 500 years, the maps are not that different. The flooding and the mudslides and all the other indicators pretty much resemble a catastrophic event that is once in a century, and unfortunately, it's likely to occur again because of climate change, and we need to be prepared for that. So the highlights of what happened there are, beyond discussion at this point. We know thousands of deaths. We know about over $100 billion in damages, and we know about all that, and I'm not going to dwell too much on that, on defining that event. But it's also true that people in this room and other people in the diaspora were instrumental in mobilizing in support of Puerto Rico in many ways. There's a report that talks about, a recent report by Yanis Petrovich and others that highlights the contribution of diaspora organizations and philanthropic organizations with respect to the catastrophic event. But it's also important to notice that the main injection of funding comes from the Congress. And the reason for that is very simple. When you buy a house, you insure that house, right? And you put an insurance in case of anything happening, storm, flooding, what have you. Our national insurance is the Stratford Act. It helps fires in California, victims of fire in California, storms in Texas or Florida and so on. We're a territory of the U.S. and we're part of that insurance, right? And because of that, all these appropriations in Congress, amounting to about close to $43 billion, were appropriated by Congress. And it took a lot of work from a lot of people. And our friends in Congress, my hat goes off to Lidia Velázquez and the leadership, both in the House and the Senate, that fought so hard for these appropriations, spearheaded by the diaspora. Make no mistake about that. Because we vote, because we have elected officials, and because we made a difference, and we can continue making a difference. And that's very important to keep in mind. Why? Because this thing is still happening. It's still unfolding. And the first item that I want to highlight is that of all that funding that was appropriated by Congress, only a small fraction, about 13, close to $14 billion. So there are $29 billion still in the air, appropriated but not getting to Puerto Rico. There are all kinds of reasons for that. The most important one is political acrimony, okay? And I will say, I shouldn't say this thing, but I will say it's vindictiveness from a president that doesn't quite understand the suffering that is going on in Puerto Rico or the appreciation of the efforts that needs to be made to turn that situation around. But it's also that there are other factors, and I'm going to briefly go through some of them, that is not just that the money is not getting there, that is needed, okay? Most of those $14 million that went to Puerto Rico went into the emergency phase, and 90% and over went to non-resident companies. Think about that, and the implications of that moving forward. Now, just casually, Secretary Mnuchin announced that they may take the tax exemption for the expenditures in taxes that multinational corporations have in Puerto Rico. That's a long story, what Act 154 is. And when it was enacted, I opposed it, because it was not the way to encourage the pharmaceutical industry in Puerto Rico, which is an anchor of that economy. But having said that, the fact is that it accounts for over a fifth, more than 20% of the appropriations in the budget today. That figure is a little bit older. Why? Because revenues have continued to decline, and the exports have continued to increase. The pharmaceutical industry in Puerto Rico is very powerful. On top of that, that would be a significant, devastating cut to the budget, if Act 154 is eliminated. But wait a minute, I haven't finished yet. We have the Medicaid appropriations that were made for Puerto Rico for 2 years as a temporary fill gap after Maria ended in September. And it's still putting in balance for the new budget negotiations, which they're happening right now. Okay, so that's going on right now, and we, obviously we have a panel for that, and we hopefully will dissect that a little bit more. But this affects over half the population in Puerto Rico that depend on Medicaid because they're poor, because the system in Puerto Rico cannot do anything else with the health system. So now we have revenues, 20%. We have Medicaid that affects half the population, and that's not all. So I'm going to give you some other, facts, and I will direct you to read more on this in a Centro publication that we put this fast print on the origins and consequences of the crisis. And I'm not going to go too deep into that, but I will say that there's a pamphlet that you can print on the internet, and we may have extra copies downstairs, that summarizes all the arguments. And I'm going to just have a few slides about that. But I direct you to understand everything that happened to this point, to that. So the bottom line is that after everything is said and done, we have severe austerity going on, budget cuts and what have you. We have a significant restructuring of the budget. Let me see if this works. Oh yeah, it works. Okay. So, you can see the cuts to what they call essential services have been significant, right? I'm not going to tell you more than the underlying problem is that we had a government size that was too big for the revenues that were coming in. So there must have been some restructuring. The issue is not that the government services need to be restructured. You have fewer students, you need fewer teachers, and you need fewer schools. The issue is how is this done? And who is the victim of the reorganization? Who are the most affected by this reorganization? That's the issue. And what I would suggest is that all these cuts, which are significant to the services provided to Puerto Rico, have a trade-off with this item here, because since PROMESA was enacted, right, we did not pay anything. There was a stay in the repayment of the debt. So for a couple of years, we did not pay after July 1st of 2016. There was a stay. We paid that year about $1 billion, but there were $2 more billion due shortly after the stay was enacted. Had that not happened, my opinion is that it would have been chaotic, because the suits and everything else, constitutionally wise, those bonds would have been to be paid first. Some people argue, and in retrospect they might not be that wrong, that we should have let it go and have a chaotic situation, whatever. Let them send the troops. But having said that, this is a very interesting item. You know what that funding is for? Any guess? To repay the debt. Why? Because the debt has been restructured. And I'm going to spend a little bit of time on that to frame the conversation of the different panels that we have today, okay? So the first thing I want to say is that there is a restructuring agreement for some of the major debt in Puerto Rico. Not all debt, but most of the debt in Puerto Rico. And there are some that are a significant portion of them. Altogether, they account for a big chunk of not all of those agreements are in place, by the way. But what they project is that they will reduce substantially. That, at first glance, the haircut is, close to 50%. That's not even close to reality. And the experts that estimate these things are having trouble estimating how much of the debt is really cut. But I'm going to leave that for what it is. But what I will say, which is the important part, is that when you look at the projected debt service, which is what matters with respect to the budget, remember? I made that argument. Right? Prior to the enactment of PROMESA, Puerto Rico would have paid on average for the next 10 years, to 2026, about 3.3, what have you, $billion annually. Now think about it. The Puerto Rico government budget is about $9 billion right now. Okay? Now think about the whole of that payment of the debt, right? As Garcia Padilla would have said in August of 2015, the Puerto Rico debt is unpaid. Okay, you cannot pay that money and not dismantle the country. You might as well turn the lights off and walk away, because there's no foundation for the economy there. However, in the subsequent fiscal plan, from Garcia Padilla to the first 2 years of Governor Rosselló, the projections in the fiscal plan was to pay over 10 years about $755 million, slightly less, $750 million, right? So far, so good. Those were the projections. The restructuring that hasn't ended yet, that accounts in this case, I'm counting the debt services projected for general obligations, the retirement fund, and the buildings, funding. Only three. There are others. I'm not going to go into the details. But this figure of $1.465 billion refers only to those three. There are others that are pending. My point is that figure is likely to reach up. And if you include in the first category, include PREPA alone is going to be more like $400 billion. So this is going to be closer to $2 billion. Okay? So when you look at the impact of the restructuring of the debt, spearheaded by the Fiscal Oversight and Management Board, I will argue that is insufficient a haircut or a reduction of the debt to satisfy a path for the economy to growth. That's my contention with this example. And I'm going to use one example of a debt that hasn't been approved there, a debt restructuring that hasn't been approved, which is the energy company, the PREPA. Why? Because we have a whole panel on that too. And that's important for you to understand what's happening with that. First of all, there are many details on this, but basically what's going to happen is that they're going to increase the rates that we currently pay to pay for the bonds, about $8 billion restructuring of the bonds on PREPA. That's the bottom line of it. That you have to impose an additional tax on the rates that we currently pay. Now, we have about the highest payments of per kilowatt, which is now in the low 20 cents per kilowatt. Okay, that's pretty high. The highest is Hawaii, about 27. This arrangement will add about close to 5 cents on the kilowatt consumed by Puerto Rican households. When you project that, this is by a study of Ramon Cao, a colleague from the University of Puerto Rico, an economist, and he's independent from other interests. He projects 170,000, he's an econometrician, and he's run for many years an econometric model that makes this kind of prediction, so I will say that he knows what he's talking about. They lost over 170,000 jobs, about 22% decrease in gross national product. Why? Because energy goes and affects each and everything that we do in the economy. It's a cumulative effect. If you think that the Jones Act is a constraint on the Puerto Rican economy, this is way, multiple times what that effect might be on the consumer side, okay? How the assumptions were made to estimate the cost that is necessary for prep are beyond, I'm happy to share that with you and the documents that support that. But the bottom line is that Puerto Rico will see close to 50% increase in the rates that consumers pay already. That's why you have the loss of jobs that you have. You also are exceeding many times the average cost in the U.S. and exceeding the highest rates in the nation, which are Hawaiian rates. Okay, this is just to put it in context, right? This hasn't been approved, by the way. There is a lot of action that can happen. Why? Because it has to go through the legislature, and to impose this restructuring agreement, they have to amend more than a dozen laws in Puerto Rico. So if the legislation were to do nothing, right, this would have to be renegotiated automatically. It depends on amending environmental laws, the energy policy. I can go down the list. More than a dozen laws would have to be amended. So this is not ended yet. Contrary to the restructuring that the Fiscal Oversight Board already approved, this one is still pending. So there is something you guys can do. We together can do. My job is just to talk, by the way. My job description is to explain, to write papers, right? And go figure. Just what I like to do. But in any case, if we were to use the debt to assets ratio, which is a standard measure of what debt is sustainable by an electrical company, the average in the U.S. is about a little more than 50 cents, 56 cents on the dollar, right? So if we were to impose that, the manageable debt will be much lower than what is being proposed, about half, about $4 billion in debt that we can carry, and that will represent less than 2 cents increase, not 5 cents, as I said before, which will be more amicable to economic growth in Puerto Rico. Okay, is this too complicated? Do we have I'm sorry. I'm an economist and I tend to, get excited about numbers and econometrics and stuff like that, but I know regular people don't get excited about this, but anyway, it's my fault. Okay, you think this is all? No, it's not all. Okay? Pensions were spared the brunt of the restructuring in Puerto Rico. Remember, constitutionally, that has priority over pensions. But the diaspora and many friends fought hard to include the pensions in the restructuring, and this represents, in my view, a good compromise, though I know there are some people that are most affected. The people with the highest earnings and so forth are the ones, higher pension, are the ones that are most affected. But I will say that what could have been would have been much worse than the deal that they get. But now there's a big catch here, right, which is that before the pensions were bankrupt because they ate up all the reserves, right? And one of the last payments that they made, they used all the reserves that were left to make the payment, right? So basically, this is pay as you go from the revenues of the government. Now, remember, we have 20% of the budget hanging out on Secretary Mnuchin and the Trump administration. We have the Medicaid cliff. We have, add it up. We have the increase in the cost of electricity. When you add all that up, right, what is the revenue that we can count on to pay as you go these pensions? Now, before, the pensions were sacrificed to balance the budget, just like borrowing was used to balance the budget. So here we are. We are now the pensioners of the government. Prospectively, they may make some change and do what needs to be done to create investment funds and so forth that will guarantee that people, when they retire, like we do here in the States, get paid, right? But for now, everyone who was in a pension system to this point, right, not prospectively, depends on pay as you go. Now think about that. You work for 30 years, my sister's a teacher, 30 years, all of a sudden, not only your my brother in the U.S., it goes a long list of people that are affected. And all of a sudden, pay as you go? Really? Really? By the way, Puerto Rico has one of the highest rates of people getting Social Security the minute they qualify. at a reduced rate, because that's the way they are surviving. There are no jobs for middle-aged folks and what have you. Now, after everything is said and done, these are the projections by the Fiscal Management and Oversight Board, okay? These are the 3 fiscal plans projections. This is gross domestic product growth, right? And this is a measure that economists use to see, okay, what are the prospects for the future? So, after everything is said and done, let me interpret this for you. By 2023, by the way, the blue line were the Garcia Padilla, fiscal plan projections, and they were, I would say, this is prior to Maria, obviously, and they were sort of optimistic projections. Now, these other 2 projections, fiscal plan 2018 and 2019, all this increase, remember, it was the Hurricane Maria impact, which was about that is right. But all this increase is based on an injection of federal funding, remember, that hasn't gotten to Puerto Rico yet. So these projections are, I would say, as an economist, kind of flimsy, okay? But let's assume that that is true, that we can speed it up and get all that injection of capital in Puerto Rico. This is the best you can promise me? Really? After all the austerity and all the misery and the treatment that we've gotten from the federal government? Really? Really? And a sustained economic decline, even after 10 years of promesa. I mean, even if we meet the target of restoring access to capital markets, which is the main goal of promesas, let me say it again. Really? This is the promise that we got? Really? This is it? Ay, Dios mío. But anyway, let's turn to more positive aspects of this presentation. Doomsday Meléndez was not intended to come out, but here we are. And I'm sorry for all the bad news, but if this doesn't get you excited to go out and take some action, if you think that what you do doesn't count, think again, and think again, because it makes a huge difference for us to be out there, with an action agenda. By the way, a unitary action agenda. That's a different conversation. But so let me say, one of the most important aspects of the crisis in Puerto Rico, and the reason we label this conference Puerto Rico, Puerto Ricans, is that whatever happens in Puerto Rico affects all of us, 9 million people, and affects the diaspora, and it's redefining the diaspora. And it's important to keep it in mind that we're connected by the umbilical cord, whether we like it or not. All this exodus has redefined our community. What is a negative for Puerto Rico, the loss of population, has become a big positive and a challenge, providing, culturally competent services and what have you. The exodus of students. It's complicated, but nonetheless, we're bringing a lot of talent, a lot of young people to the States with a lot of potential in affecting communities at the local level. And that's an important thing to keep in mind. But it's not without some cost. For example, the concentration, we have a big dispersion. I'm going to show some graphics about that. We have a concentration in Florida. The demographic footprint of the Puerto Rican community has been changed. I'm not going to spend too much time on this. This is migration historically. That period here in the 50s was the so-called Great Migration. Hey, pay attention. This is the new by any measure. We have all the measures that we know of migration. Pay attention. What is this telling? It's deeper, yep. More people, yep. But it hasn't ended yet. People keep coming to the States. So that's the punchline of that. And this is how it looks in terms of population in Puerto Rico and the U.S. Okay? And I've said this before. Every time my wife looks at this, starts crying, and I turn the computer off because I don't want to make her suffer. Pero bendito que va a pasar. That's what she said. And I don't have words for that. But in any case, so I was saying that exodus, that migration, has created Puerto Ricans in the U.S. to be one of the fastest growing segments in the population, even more than Hispanics and what have you. So we're redefining not just the Puerto Rican community. Now remember, 2/3 in the diaspora, 1/3 in Puerto Rico. Hint, That hasn't happened in the Puerto Rican history forever, right? So this is a new historical window that we need to figure out what's happening. But what's happening in Puerto Rico, which is a net loss of population, continued loss in population, actually represents a net gain for our communities in the States. And this is how the map looks like, okay? This is the sort of the dispersion of the Puerto Rican community. Oh, by the way, any graphic that I show here is in our website. Just go there and type whatever you need, and it will be there. So in some report of some kind. This one is forthcoming of migration. We just got the data Thursday, and my data team already produced. God bless them for that. A few slides for you. So this is how migration is distributed throughout the U.S. and obviously we have some new faces. The growing people in the new South. It's new, beginning in Virginia and going down to Georgia. Texas is new. Anyway, so the distribution has changed. But you also have a renewal of migration that was declining in New York, Pennsylvania, and some of the traditional anchors. Now, by the way, this is all, sociology. There is a lot of work to be done here, okay? Now, what happened is that, that depopulation of Puerto Rico has consequences. And it has to do with school closes, decline of revenues, and what have you. So let me turn to the second question that I promised I will address, even if so briefly. Where do we go from here? So let me, I guess very quickly, talk about some future scenarios. The first one is that this business with the Fiscal Oversight Board needs to be resolved. We know that just what they're doing, austerity and fiscal controls, is not going to get the Puerto Rico economy out of the decline that it's been experiencing for more than a decade now. They say so. They know so. And one of the recommendations was to have congressional action that will create so-called, a Marshall Plan by increasing help to the needy population in Puerto Rico, basically nutritional assistance, earned income tax credits, child tax credits, and the like. That's not going to solve the economy, but it's a floor plan. Why? Because most of those plans are not equal as Puerto Ricans receive in the stateside, or other American citizens receive stateside. And just bringing party on that will be not only a fair, but also a significant injection of economic development for Puerto Rico. In terms of reconstruction, we have a problem with the funding getting there. But when the funds get there, are our organizations and residents going to be the main beneficiaries of that support? And the answer is a question mark. I'm not sure that that's the case. So we need to take action, and many of the people here in the audience are taking action, to strengthen the civic capacity to participate in that new phase of the economic development of Puerto Rico and reconstruction. It's very important that we create that capacity. And, we don't have a panel devoted to that right now, but we have a lot of that posted in our website from prior conferences, and we have a report from Centro addressing this, and any information that you need on how you can participate in that reconstruction, I'll be happy to share. We also need a realignment of political forces, which started with the last election, by the way. The independent vote getting to 17% is a new phenomenon in Puerto Rico. Over 50% of people registered to vote and not voting is a new event, is a new thing in Puerto Rico. It's up for the take to have a realignment of forces. And I'm not saying we need to eliminate the existing parties. I think they both are lacking a lot of vision as to what the problems and solutions are for Puerto Rico. But I'm not a political scientist, I could be wrong on this. But what I will suggest to you is that without that realignment, focusing on good government, focusing on what needs to happen for the benefit of Puerto Rican people, none of these other problems are going to be resolved. That we need a political movement that is reflective of good governance, good government, and that weeds out corruption, in my opinion. Okay. And I will say that of all the things that I've mentioned as a future scenario, we have a great opportunity here in the diaspora to affect change in Puerto Rico. Okay, we have bigger problems in the diaspora as well. But I think, if we can come up with a minimalist agenda of the 2 or 3 things, many of which I have mentioned here, you know, look at PREPA, look at financial support to Puerto Rico from the Stratford Act, the funding that needs to go there. Look at the restructuring you know, there is a minimalist agenda here in which most people in the diaspora will agree on. If we can come up with that, I think we can make a great difference moving forward. And so let me wrap it up by saying, you know, you have a lot of resources. We have, you know, a very pointed agenda in terms of how Centro supports what's going on in Puerto Rico. There are a bunch of publications that address some of these problems. That are, you know, there's a quick listing of them there. There are some others that are coming. Oh, by the way, this one's on the 2 years of Post Maria. I think we have copies somewhere downstairs. But the one that is forthcoming on mitigation, we have one of the co-authors here, Rafael. He's going to talk about that a bit more in the panel. I'm sorry. We have a program. By the way, the nonprofit sector capacity is also forthcoming. We have a draft of that. We have a program that is broadcast by CUNY TV and BronzeNet and now other, you know, you started with WIPR. WIPR is a different story. But we still, after this is broadcast, we put them on YouTube and we try to share with partners. It tells the story about people that are making a difference from their own perspective. So it's a very important addition to and then we have, you know, newsletters and briefs. If you're not subscribed to them and you want to receive, you know, periodic updates on what's going on and events that we do, please do so. So I will end by saying that the fact that we're all now, well, the fact that 2/3 of the Puerto Rican people now are in the diaspora, it's a big game changer. Why? Because we vote for Congress, whether Puerto Ricans in the island have a right or not. We vote. We have elected public officials, some of which are here, some from Massachusetts. And we can influence with them what congressional delegations, what the senators in our respective states will do. And we can also participate in the recovery more directly, partnering with local organizations there. And all in all, I think if we can come up with an agenda, right, and we can engage, you know, start thinking about 9 million, not 3 and 6 or what have you. You know, think about 9 million and think about how we're interconnected between the island and the diaspora. And think about the specific steps that we can take. I think we will go a long way para los de aquí y para los de allá. Gracias.